Welcome to Ageless with Adrianne. I'm Adrianne Caparuso. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about stroke survivor training. If you are a stroke survivor or if you have a loved one who's a stroke survivor, there are some different things that you can do. I've talked in some other videos about how sometimes physical therapy will run out, insurance won't pay for anymore, and there's still more recovery to be had. Sometimes physical therapists don't have anything more to do with the patient or you, and so they because of insurance and how the system works, you get handed off to your own device, left to your own devices. But there are stroke survivor trainers out there. I'm one of them. And there are other things that can be done because improvements can come over a course of years. It's not all going to happen in the first, I know a lot of times they say the most recovery is going to happen in like the first few weeks or the first few months. And there is truth that there is good recovery that can happen then, but recovery can happen well beyond that time. And because you hear that time frame, sometimes it can be discouraging when you don't see or your loved one doesn't see the recovery that they want in those first few months. So the first thing I want to talk about is posture, because posture is really, really important, because when there's a stroke, a lot of times there can be a sagging, there can be, the muscles aren't necessarily being worked the way that they are meant to work based on the disconnect between the brain and the body. So we're trying to stimulate things neurologically. That's the whole goal, is to get things stimulated, because part of what your brain-body connection has gone away based on the stroke, but we're trying to bring that back. So I'm going to sit down for the first thing, because the first thing we want to do is we want to look at hip alignment. The hips are key for stroke survivors, to make sure that there's good hip alignment, because sometimes there's this, right, or this, and you want to try to get the survivor to sit upright and keep the hips squared. So there's flexion and extension of the hips, and you might have to help your stroke survivor, or you might need help yourself if you're the stroke survivor, but we want to look at some hip extension and flexion. So when we stand up, there's an extension going on. And then when we sit back down, we've got that flexion. So we want to make sure that we have the ability, or the survivor has the ability, to extend and flex the hips. That's one of the first keys, because we want to have good postural alignment. So while I'm seated, I'm going to show you the next thing. So we talked about the hips. Let me show you, before I go on to the next joint, let me talk about abduction and adduction, right? So the hips, we talked about flexion and extension, sitting and standing, but is the survivor also able to do abduction and adduction? You can do it seated or standing. I'm going to show you standing. So adduction, taking out, and that requires balance too. But when you have a stroke survivor, if you are the stroke survivor, make sure that you have something stable to hold on to, a bar, something that's not going to move, a countertop, something that will allow for you or the survivor to be a little bit wobbly and not lose balance and fall. That's the last thing we want. So we have this abduction and adduction happening here. So adduction out, abduction in. And the same thing on the other side, in and out. Now, if you were to do this seated, and again, you would turn your body, wherever the bar is or the counter, you would turn your body to make sure that you have something safe and stable to hold on to. If you're seated, because the standing is not great yet, because there are issues from the stroke, then if you're seated, you can try to open up the hips this way. Let me move my Bosu ball. Open up the hips this way, adduction, abduction. And so this is working, you can see this is working the hip joint, and that's one of the things that we want to make sure remains strong. Can the stroke survivor do this? It's pretty important. Okay? So we did the flexion and the extension, the standing and the sitting, where we extended the hip, and then with flexion, we brought it back together, then opening up the adduction and bringing in the abduction, okay? Now let's move down to the knees. Same thing with the knees. When we stand, we're extending, right? So if you're seated, because you can't stand, the extension looks like this. Is the stroke survivor able to do this? And on both sides. Because again, these are the foundational movements for our bodies when we're walking, and we want to make sure that we can safely do that. Okay? So extension and flexion of the knees. So now we've done hips, we've done knees. What's next? We're going to move down to the ankles. This part of the body is incredibly important because, again, this is what I just said. This is what we need for movement, for walking, right? So if there's a stroke survivor who's had a stroke and the left side is impacted, maybe there's a limp on one side or there's dragging of a leg. You want to make sure that there's good hip alignment when trying to rectify some of what's happening there. So let's go, I'm going to slide a little bit back, a little bit further back in my chair. Let's look at the ankles, right? The ankles are next. We need those to walk. So again, flexion, extension, flexion, extension. And we're going to do adduction, abduction. So moving them in all planes of motion to make sure that they can move. Now, you might not be able to, I sat back and did 2 legs at the same time. You might do 1 at a time, and that's fine too. So flexion, extension. We want the joints functioning properly. And if there's an issue where the stroke survivor cannot do it, continue working at it. Continue trying these exercises on a regular basis. Because again, we are trying to stimulate things neurologically to bring some of this motion back to them. Okay, so in this video, I'm talking to you about the joints and why they're important. Posturally, they're incredibly important. We need those hips squared and in alignment. We need the knees to be able to bend and flex, to extend and bend. And we also need the ankles because when you walk, you use that ankle. It's the movement of the ankle from heel to toe. That's your ankle that needs to be able to have the movement. So with stroke survivors, if those exercises are not going well, like there's a side that can't be done, keep working on it. Keep trying to get the movement back into those joints. Okay, so those are some exercises to start with your stroke survivor, or if you're the stroke survivor.